1994, Los Angeles. You've got the sunshine, the celebrities, that whole California image.
Yeah, just this iconic backdrop.
And then, bang, the brutal murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman in Brentwood. It just shattered every scene.
Absolutely. And suddenly, O.J. Simpson, this huge star, is the prime suspect.
It wasn't just a trial, was it? They called it the trial of the century. But it felt like forensic science itself was kind of on trial, too.
It really did. And then the verdict, after less than 3 hours, not guilty.
Still stunning. How did that happen?
Well, that's the core question, isn't it? How does a case with so much apparent physical evidence end in acquittal? It forces you to look closer.
Not just at the science, but how it was all handled.
Exactly, the whole process.
And that's what we're digging into for you today. If you want to understand this landmark case, the twists, the complexities, without drowning in detail, you're in the right place.
We've gone through this great YouTube transcript from Real Stories that revisited the case.
Our mission here is really to unpack that evidence, the controversies around how it was collected, analyzed.
Yeah.
Basically, why that mountain of evidence the prosecution talked about just didn't hold up for the jury.
And, you know, looking back, it's such a clear example of a fundamental truth in investigations. The absolute critical need for integrity in handling physical evidence. Every step, from the crime scene right to the courtroom.
Because any slip-up,
any mishandling, any break in that chain of custody, it just opens the door for reasonable doubt. And that can overshadow even, really powerful science.
Okay, so let's rewind. June 13th, 1994. The morning after.
Yeah.
A dog barking leads neighbors to Nicole Brown Simpson's condo. What did those first officers find?
Well, it was obviously a horrific scene. Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman, deceased, right there on the walkway.
10 clues.
Immediately noticeable were bloody shoe prints leading away. There was a blood-soaked glove, a dark knit cap.
Like a ski mask type thing.
Yeah, a pullover cap. And the initial police thought was, okay, single killer, probably a rage killing, very violent.
Detective Lang was one of the first there. He noticed something specific about those footprints, didn't he? Something a bit off.
He did, yeah. He described the pattern as suggesting maybe an unsteady gait, like hesitation.
Hesitation.
Yeah, and even a couple of prints seemed to point back towards the bodies. It made him wonder, did the killer pause? Maybe drop something?
Which we now think was probably that glove and cap.
Seems likely, yes.
Okay, so from that scene, Lang heads over to O.J. Simpson's place on Rockingham. What happens there?
Right. Lang, along with other detectives like Furman and Van Etter, they go to notify Simpson about his ex-wife. When they get there, they see his white Ford Bronco.
The infamous Bronco.
The very one, parked kind of oddly outside the gate. And Furman looks inside, sees a black bag. It said Orenthal Productions. And crucially, a spot of what looked like blood near the driver's door handle.
And this is where things get legally complicated. They decide to go onto the property without a warrant.
Yeah, that became a huge point of contention later.
What was their reasoning at the time?
Their stated reason, according to Lang's testimony, was they were worried about Simpson himself. Seeing blood, no answer at the gate. They feared he might be inside, hurt, maybe even another victim.
So a welfare check, essentially.
That was the justification. Furman ended up climbing over the wall to let the others in.
And it's Furman who makes the next big discovery, right?
That's right. While the others are kind of focused on the main house, Furman goes around back near where Cato Kalin was staying in the bungalow.
Yeah.
And there it is. Plain sight. A second bloody glove. And it looks like a match to the one found back at the Bundy scene.
Wow. Okay, so that's
huge.
the moment Simpson goes from potential victim or grieving ex to the prime suspect. Instantly.
And the evidence at Rockingham kept coming, didn't it? It wasn't just the glove.
No. As it got light, Van Etter noticed blood drops, small drops, but distinct on the driveway.
Leading from where?
Leading from where the Bronco was parked towards the house entrance. Then they found more blood inside the foyer and also inside the Bronco itself. So at that point, they impound the Bronco.
Yes, they secured the vehicle and got a warrant to do a full search of the property.
Okay, meanwhile, Simpson gets back from a trip to Chicago. Lang and Van Etter interview him. What stands out from that interview?
A few things. First, he had this pretty noticeable deep cut on his left hand, on a finger.
And his explanation.
It was inconsistent. At first, he said something about breaking a glass in his Chicago hotel room. Then he mentioned maybe reopening an old cut he got back in L.A. It wasn't clear.
And what about his whereabouts the night before?
They found him evasive on that point, not really giving straight answers about what he was doing during the crucial time window.
Speaking of timelines, the limo driver who took him to the airport that night, His testimony became important, right?
Very important. The driver arrived early, scheduled pickup was later, but he got there around 10:25 p.m.
Yeah.
He buzzed the intercom, no answer. Crucially, he testified he did not see the white Bronco parked outside at that time. He comes back closer to 11:47 p.m. Now, he sees the Bronco parked on the street. He sees a figure, kind of shadowy, rushing into the house. Then he finally gets Simpson on the intercom.
And Simpson's excuse.
Said he'd overslept and was rushing. But the timeline suggests the murders likely happened around 10:30 p.m. The driver's account really tightened that window and made Simpson's story seem less plausible.
So you've got physical evidence linking him to both scenes, the glove, the blood. You've got timeline issues. What about motive? Why would he do it? What did the prosecution argue?
They built their motive argument based on interviews with Nicole's friends and family. They pointed to a history of domestic violence.
There was that 1989 incident, wasn't there?
Yes, a well-documented 911 call where Nicole reported Simpson assaulting her. They also brought up allegations of stalking behavior after the divorce. And Nicole had apparently been worried about a missing set of keys to her condo.
And those keys were found.
Found in Simpson's possession when he was arrested.
Okay. And then rather than turning himself in as arranged,
we get the infamous slow-speed Bronco chase. Him in the back, his friend A.C. Cowlings driving, police following, the whole thing live on TV.
absolutely surreal.
It ended back at his house in Brentwood, where he eventually surrendered.
So looking at all of that, the two gloves, Simpson's blood at Bundy, his blood in the Bronco, the victim's blood in the Bronco, the victim's blood on the glove found at his house, the timeline, the motive. The prosecution must have felt incredibly confident. Lang called it a mountain of evidence.
Absolutely. From their perspective, it was overwhelming. They believed the physical evidence pointed directly and solely at Simpson. They thought it was, pretty much a slam dunk.
But that mountain started to crumble under the defense's attack, didn't it? They went straight for the forensic evidence.
They did. The prosecution's case relied heavily on it. They even brought in Rod Englert, a crime scene reconstruction expert, to paint a picture of how it happened.
Right. What was Englert's theory? How did he say the murders unfolded?
Englert proposed a sequence. He suggested Simpson attacked Nicole first, causing head trauma, then stabbing her. As she fell, Goldman arrived.
Just terrible timing.
Awful. Then a struggle between Simpson and Goldman, during which Englert believed the first glove was dropped. Then Simpson incapacitates Goldman, goes back to Nicole, cuts her throat, then cuts Goldman's throat. He even suggested Simpson left a shoe print on Nicole's back.
And the cut on Simpson's finger.
Englert theorized that happened during the struggle, maybe while pulling off a glove forcefully, which would explain the trail of Simpson's blood drops leading away.
It's a very specific narrative. But the real power, supposedly, was the DNA. This was cutting-edge stuff back then, right?
Absolutely revolutionary. Before DNA, you had basic blood typing, ABO groups, things like that. It could exclude someone, but it couldn't pinpoint an individual.
Not like DNA.
Not at all. DNA analysis, especially with techniques like PCR, which is basically a way to amplify tiny amounts of DNA.
Like a photocopier for DNA.
Kind of, yeah. And RFLP, an early method for comparing DNA patterns. It allowed scientists to link biological evidence, like blood or hair, to a specific person with incredible probability, almost unique identification.
And the results in the Simpson case were, well, the word used was stunning. What did the DNA show?
The prosecution presented expert testimony saying blood drops leading away from the Bundy scene matched Simpson's DNA profile. The odds given were astronomical. For one drop, the chance of it belonging to someone else was put at 1 in 170 million. For blood on the back gate, the probability stated was even higher, basically excluding anyone else on the planet.
Wow.
Plus, Simpson's blood was confirmed inside the Bronco, and maybe even more damning, DNA from both Nicole and Goldman was found on the Bronco's center console.
And the glove, the one in Rockingham.
DNA from both victims was found on that glove too, linking Simpson's property directly to both victims.
That sounds utterly conclusive, just scientifically undeniable.
On paper, yes, but the defense wasn't attacking the science itself, not directly. They brought in their own experts, like Herbert McDonald, a blood spatter guy.
What was his take?
McDonald questioned things like the amount of blood in the Bronco. He argued that for such a violent crime, if it happened partly inside the vehicle, you'd expect to see a lot more blood, more spatter. He thought the amount found was surprisingly small.
Interesting. So seeds of doubt even there. But the main defense strategy was really about how the evidence was collected and handled, wasn't it? Contamination, mishandling.
Exactly. They argued that the first 24 hours were crucial and, frankly, chaotic. Lack of coordination between the detectives, the criminalists, the coroner's office.
And the media showing up so early didn't help.
Not at all. Even the prosecution's own expert, Englert, admitted the media presence was a major distraction. It just wasn't a controlled scene.
The defense specifically criticized Detective Lang using a blanket from Nicole's house to cover her body, right? Potential contamination.
They did. They argued, could fibers or hairs from the blanket get on the body? Could it compromise trace evidence?
How did Lang respond to that?
He said it was a clean hospital blanket, readily available, and that ultimately no foreign hairs or fibers were found that couldn't be accounted for. He felt it was a necessary act of respect.
But the media presence gave the defense visual ammunition, didn't it? Footage from the scene.
Oh, definitely. They used news footage in court to show what they claimed were breaches of protocol. Officers maybe not changing gloves between handling different items.
Cross-contamination risk.
Exactly. Unauthorized people wandering around the crime scene perimeter. These images were powerful for the jury, suggesting carelessness.
And they really zeroed in on Dennis Fung, the lead criminalist. His collection techniques came under intense fire.
They did. The defense focused on how he collected blood, mainly using cotton swabs. They pointed out that some swabs were put into paper bindles while still wet.
Which is bad because
moisture can encourage bacterial growth, which can degrade DNA, makes the results less reliable potentially. They also highlighted that Fung left the collected evidence sample sitting in his van.
in the California heat.
Yeah, for several hours, not refrigerated. Again, not ideal for preserving DNA evidence. Experts on both sides would agree that's not best practice.
And wasn't there that moment in court during Fung's cross-examination with the video?
Yes, the video clip that appeared to show Fung touching an evidence envelope without gloves on.
That must have looked terrible to the jury.
It was very effective visually. The defense used it to paint a picture of systemic sloppiness, arguing, if they're this careless, how can we trust any of the results?
And all this tied into their bigger narrative.
The police conspiracy theory, that this wasn't just incompetence, but maybe intentional planting of evidence to frame Simpson.
Okay, let's look at some specific examples where they argued planting. That blood on the back gate at Bundy found weeks later.
Right. The defense jumped on that. Why wasn't it found during the initial, very thorough search? They suggested it was planted after the fact.
Did the police have an explanation?
Lang admitted it should probably have been found earlier, an oversight. But the defense added another layer. They claimed the DNA in that sample wasn't degraded enough for having been exposed to the elements for 3 weeks. Suspicious, they said.
Then there were the socks. Nicole's blood found on socks from OJ's bedroom. That sounds bad for him.
It did. The prosecution's expert, Englert, had his spatter theory blood flicks onto the sock as Simpson steps in pools of blood at the scene.
Makes sense.
But the defense experts, McDonnell and the famous Dr. Henry Lee, looked at the stains under magnification. They concluded it wasn't spatter.
What was it then?
They argued it was more consistent with contact transfer, like the blood was wiped or pressed onto the sock. McDonnell even did a demo showing blood sitting on the surface fibers, not soaked through, suggesting maybe Simpson's foot wasn't even in the sock when the blood got there. Implying it could have been planted, dabbed onto the sock later.
And then came the EDTA bombshell. What was that about?
EDTA is a chemical, an anticoagulant, commonly used as a preservative in blood collection tubes, the purple top ones they use in labs.
Okay.
Defense experts testified they found EDTA in the blood stain on the sock and also in the sample from the back gate.
But not in regular blood.
Well, tiny trace amounts can occur naturally, but they argued the levels found were much higher, consistent with blood that came from one of those preserved test tubes.
Suggesting the blood didn't come directly from a person at the scene, but from a lab sample taken from Simpson or the victims later.
Exactly, suggesting planting, using blood drawn after the fact. That was a huge blow to the prosecution's blood evidence.
Wow. Okay, let's talk about the gloves.
Look.
So symbolic in this trial.
Absolutely central. You have one glove at the murder scene, covered in blood. The matching glove found behind Cato Kalin's bungalow at Simpson's place, also bloody, with DNA from both victims.
A seemingly perfect link. Until
the courtroom demonstration. The infamous moment where Simpson tries on the gloves, over latex gloves, and they clearly don't fit, or appear not to.
If it doesn't fit, you must acquit. Cochran's line.
Became the catchphrase of the trial.
What was the prosecution's explanation for why they didn't fit?
They argued the gloves could have shrunk. Being soaked in blood, then drying out, could cause the leather to contract.
Did the defense buy that?
Not at all. Their expert, McDonnell, did his own test. Got an identical pair of gloves, soaked them in blood, let them dry.
And
He testified they shrank minimally, less than 1%. The glove manufacturer had suggested possible shrinkage of maybe 10–15%. McDonnell's results contradicted that significantly. His conclusion was the gloves likely wouldn't have fit Simpson anyway.
so the defense theory became that the second glove, the one at Rockingham, must have been planted, and they pointed the finger directly at.
Mark Furman. Because he was at both scenes. He found the glove at Rockingham. The defense suggested he could have picked it up at Bundy and dropped it at Simpson's estate.
Did Lang think that was plausible?
Lane argued against it. He pointed to logs showing Furman arrived relatively late at Bundy, and he argued Furman finding the glove made sense in context. He was checking the perimeter after talking to Cato Callan.
The defense even suggested Furman used the glove to smear blood in the Bronco.
Yes, Lang strongly refuted that. He explained the blood patterns in the Bronco were more consistent with transfer from bloody hands or clothes, not a deliberate smear with a glove.
But then came the Furman tapes, the evidence of his racist language. That changed everything, didn't it?
It was explosive. The defense uncovered recordings where Furman repeatedly used racial slurs, expressed deep hatred towards black people. It became their final weapon, as the source put it.
How so?
It utterly destroyed Furman's credibility on the stand, and it provided a powerful, albeit circumstantial, motive for planting evidence, racial animus towards Simpson.
Even though Lang argued Furman's personal racism didn't prove he planted anything.
Right, Lang maintained you needed actual evidence of planting. But for the jury, hearing those tapes, it must have created enormous doubt about Furman's honesty, his actions, and the integrity of any evidence he handled. It tapped into very real, deep-seated concerns about race and policing in LA.
So despite that initial mountain of evidence, the defense chipped away at it piece by piece, questioning collection, handling, integrity, and then providing this potential motive for planting.
They created layer upon layer of doubt, and perhaps the prosecution got complacent, relying too heavily on the science, maybe holding back other evidence they had.
And the result? October 3rd, 1995. Not guilty. Lang was convinced the jury just ignored the evidence.
That was his view, yes, that
Wow.
they didn't follow instructions. But Sheik, representing the defense perspective in the transcript, saw it differently.
He saw it at us.
As a direct result of reasonable doubt, created by the LAPD's own failures in handling the evidence. He stressed the need for absolute professionalism and independence in forensic work.
It's such a stark difference in perception. Of course, the story didn't end there. There was the civil trial.
Right, wrought by the victims' families, and the outcome there was completely different.
They introduced new evidence, didn't they? Like the photos of Simpson wearing those Bruno Magli shoes?
Yes, shoes that seemed to match the unique bloody footprints found at the Bundy scene. That, plus the lower burden of proof in a civil case.
Preponderance of the evidence, not beyond a reasonable doubt.
Exactly. The civil jury found Simpson liable for the deaths and ordered him to pay millions in damages.
So 2 trials, 2 different outcomes, based largely on the same core events, but different evidence standards and presentations.
But focusing back on the criminal trial, the big lesson, the one that still resonates, is about evidence integrity, how crucial it is.
Because even the best science,
Even the most powerful DNA results can be neutralized if the jury doubts how it was collected, how it was handled, who handled it. The carelessness, intentional or not, it just robbed the evidence of its power, as our source material puts it. It cast doubt on what should have been the most reliable witness of all, forensic science.
So the key takeaway here really is that procedural integrity is paramount. You can have the most advanced science in the world, but if there are questions about the collection, the chain of custody, the handling, it can all fall apart.
Absolutely. And it forces you to think about that complex mix in any trial. The hard science, human error, potential bias, the legal standards. In the Simpson case, was the verdict truly driven by technical, reasonable doubt about the evidence itself? Or did other factors, like the racial dynamics, Furman's tapes, play an even bigger role in the jury's mind?
It's a question people still debate endlessly, isn't it?
It is, and it makes you wonder, what's changed since the 90s? How have forensic procedures evolved? What safeguards are in place now to prevent these kinds of doubts from undermining investigations? That's definitely something worth considering.
It leaves you with a pretty significant thought, doesn't it? In our world, we rely more and more on scientific evidence to find the truth, especially in law.
Hmm.
So how do we make absolutely sure that this powerful tool, this most reliable witness, maintains its integrity? How do we protect it from being compromised, intentionally or just through human error?
That's the ongoing challenge, isn't it, for science, for the legal system, and for all of us who rely on them for justice.